The first deep learning concept we're going to cover is this idea of change in ecosystems. And so we can kind of summarize this as thinking about nature as always being in flux. So ecosystems are constantly undergoing change. And one way to think about ecology is the science that studies organisms, their interaction with the abiotic and biotic environment, with an understanding that all of those pieces are going to be shifting through time. We've also looked at in previous clips this idea that that science has to be integrated, right? So we know, yes, there is always change, but it has to meet certain parameters, right? So we've talked already about the laws of thermodynamics, right? So even though this isn't a physics class, ecological systems will have to obey those broader laws. And so we know, of course, those can be conceptualized as this idea that energy has to be conserved and that over time entropy will increase. So associated with this learning concept of nature being in flux, we can think about kind of older ecological paradigms, right? So a lot of you may have heard this phrase that, there's this balance of nature, right? And in that paradigm, ecological systems are thought of as being kind of in this steady state, that they might have stable points, that they might be closed systems, that they're kind of self-regulating, right? And based on that self-regulating piece, the other thing is, well, they're okay without us, right? So this idea that we are outside of natural systems, right? And if we had just left them alone, they would be in this kind of steady, closed, self-regulating state. So that's the old paradigm, and so I'm here to tell you it doesn't work that way, okay? And so that's why our first concept here is the flux of nature. So one thing is this idea that, yes, you might have a point that an ecosystem gets to, but over a certain time scale that will shift, right? So we see these points changing. We know our ecosystems are open ecosystems, right? So I used to study seed dispersal, right? So what seeds are coming into a forest or a prairie are, of course, really important in terms of dictating what plants you might find there. The other thing that why people have shifted to thinking about this flux of nature is the idea that we also have these types of disturbances that have always taken place on Earth, right? So we've had fires, we've had flooding, we have ice storms, and all of those things will obviously kill certain individuals in an ecosystem and not kill others, and they will impact it, right? And they will cause change. And so part of the shifting to this paradigm of the flux of nature was trying to understand how all those disturbances play into ecological processes. So these systems are open, right? And then also one of the big take-homes from this class is that we are modifying these systems. So one of the changes we'll talk about a lot, right, is how we alter the environment and how that causes shifts in these natural systems. So and the book talks about this in the first chapter. There is no balance of nature, right? So I put a big balance of nature with a big red mark through it to try to emphasize that. But sometimes when we think about natural systems, we might come up with examples that seem like they're examples of a balance, right? And so what I want you to do before you forward more into this video is think about how you think about, a natural system, right? And say a forest, for example, and all of the different animals and plants in it. And can you think in that system you're thinking about of ways that you might think there's a balance and other ways in which no, that would mean it's in movement. And then the other big question, we can say these things conceptually, oh, it's in flux, it's not a closed system, but how are we actually going to do the hard part, right, which is what are we going to measure to see what's changing through time? So pause the video, take a little bit to think about that before we go further. So I will say that when we do this face-to-face, one of the things that students typically bring up is this idea of predators controlling prey population sizes, right? And so isn't that a balance, right? Isn't it true that, okay, if you have wolves in Yellowstone, right, and they keep the deer population in check, then that influences the system, right? And so I do think there's ways in which we can apply this idea of a balance of nature in certain situations, but we also know that wolf population numbers are going to vary through time, right? And that also a lot of other factors will influence deer populations as well. So what I'm saying is that if we just are looking for one big phrase to summarize how ecological systems work, it's much better to think about change and to think about flux than to think about these kind of stable systems. And this ties that back to what we were already talking about in terms of defining ecology, where we have all of the different living species that interact with one another, but then they're also responding to the non-living, to the physical environment, and influencing the physical environment. And all of that is, of course, creating changes. And then there's us, right? And one of the things we'll see is we've created tremendous changes. In fact, there's this whole field of study called global change ecology because of that. So first of all, take a deep breath. You don't need to memorize all the details here, but I just have this as an example, in part to show you the complexity of how ecosystems work, and then also to show kind of these fluxes between the non-living and the living environment and how they can influence one another. So this is from your book, not from the first chapter, from a few chapters in, but it's looking at the change in the climate associated with deforestation. So what you see on the left figure is a forested landscape, and what you see on the right is the deforested landscape, right? And now you see these arrows coming out of this either forest or deforested land, showing you what happens when you remove these trees, right? So the first thing you see is the arrow for albedo gets smaller, right? So what's albedo? That's just reflectance. So if you're white, you're high, okay? So complete reflectance of light for a white surface. And so what you can see is the trees are a dark green, right? And so they're absorbing heat, right? But once you shift to this yellow, right, you're going to have more reflectance of the heat, and so your albedo increases. So that's our first arrow, and it has a cooling effect, right? And then you can see our second arrow is talking about sensible heat loss, right? And that's just if you have heat loss that happens through wind and through all of these other things that are going to occur, right, in the ecosystem, in this case, you'll have higher wind speeds, all of those types of things in the deforested landscape, and so that also has a cooling effect, right? So we might think overall, first two arrows, you take out the forest, it's going to be cooler, not hotter. But we get to our last arrow, and the last arrow is latent heat loss, evapotranspiration. So one of those things those trees are doing, they have those big deep roots, right, and they're sucking water up through their bodies and letting it out of their leaves, and that's moving all of this water in the ecosystem, and that's called evapotranspiration, and it has this huge cooling effect. You can see it over on the left. And when we move to the deforested landscape, it gets really, really smaller, and so that loss of evapotranspiration more than makes up for those other two cooling effects when you deforest a landscape, and so the net effect is warming. Okay, so hopefully you think, oh wow, that's a cool example of how a living system, the forest system, interacts with the non-living and influences it. So another point I want to make when we're talking about what is ecology and what types of change we see is about the scale at which we see ecological processes. So there's this tendencies for people to think of ecosystems as like these big places that you go and visit, right? Like I'm going to go to the forest, or I'm going to go to the prairie, or go hang out in a stream, right? But what I'm here to tell you is that you have ecosystems at every different spatial scale and at all of these different time scales, right? Because all we're talking about with ecosystems is interaction of living species with their abiotic environment, right? And the other living species. So you have, for example, when we talk about your microbiome in your stomach, right? That is an ecosystem, right? All of those different species of bacteria that live there and that help you digest your food, right? So you have ecosystems on your skin. If we think about your skin bacterial community, you have the little inverts in your eyebrows, right? So we are kind of walking ecosystems, as are other animals. So the key point here is just that you have ecosystems at all of these different biological scales, and then at all of these different spatial scales as well. So what are some other ways in which this is true, this kind of flux of natural systems? Well, we'll learn this term, and we'll actually have a whole lecture that talks about ecological succession, but I just want to bring it up here because it really does emphasize this point of the change in ecosystems. So what ecological succession refers to is that if you go to a given ecosystem, okay, so say it's a forest ecosystem, we go to it today, right? And then we go to it 100 years from now, you're going to find very different plants and animals there. So ecological succession refers to the process of change in the types of species that we find in that ecological community over time. The kind of classic example of succession is people talk about an old field, right? So you start off and the farmer leaves her field, and then all of a sudden when you go back in 10 years, you've got different types of plants and shrubs there, and you go back in 100 years and the field has become a forest, right? We could also think of an aquatic system, right, of a new pond forming and all of the colonization that would happen both from the soil and from the air that would change the algae and the bacteria and the insects that were in that pond community over time. And of course, another great example of why ecosystems are always changing is that they are all of the species in them are also evolving, right? So this shows just a very probably old example that you've probably seen 100 times of adaptive evolution, right? In this case, we're talking about bacteria, and we're talking about the adaptation in this case would be antibiotic resistance, right? And the selective force is the antibiotics, and that's causing there to be a shift in the bacteria to have antibiotic resistance, more amounts of antibiotic resistance over time, right? So again, so we have this change through time. We have this flux where at the beginning you have a certain genetic composition with not very many individuals having antibiotic resistant genes, and then at the end you have a lot more individuals having antibiotic resistant genes. So those genetic shifts in all of our species through time, right, is another example of flux. Okay, thanks. That's it for this clip.